Can I start us off then for this evening? Thank you for joining us for this event with Deborah Mattinson. My name is Michael Clegg. I'm Secretary of Cambridge for Europe. The format for this evening will be that Deborah will open with some introductory remarks. I'm going to then take Chair's prerogative and ask a couple of opening questions. And then we'll move to questions from the floor. So if you've got a question, can I, as usual, ask you to put it into the chat? It'd be helpful if you marked it clearly as a question to distinguish questions from other general chat in the chat. And can you let us know if you want to read the question yourself? If you don't, we'll assume that you're happy for us to read the question. So if you want to read it, then please let us know. Can I just let people know that we're recording the event? We'll be putting it up on our media channels later on. So if you don't want your mug on those, then you might want to switch your camera off. We've got everybody on mute as they entered. If you wanted to ask a question then and read it yourself, then we'll unmute you when the time comes. But otherwise, we'll be keeping people on mute to keep the background noise down. Okay, before we start with Deborah, could I just mention that our next event, our next upcoming event is on the 18th of February, slightly earlier time of 7 p.m. And that's going to be an event with Dame Athene Donald, who's going to be speaking on UK research and higher education in the post-Brexit climate. Okay, so that's on the 18th of February at 7 p.m. Okay, so if I could just start by introducing Deborah. Deborah Mattinson is a co-founder and director of Britain Thinks, a research agency that works with business, government and charities. She was formerly pollster to Gordon Brown as Chancellor of the Exchequer and as Prime Minister, and is a leading commentator on public opinion and the mood of the nation. In 2010, she published Talking to a Brick Wall, the story of the new Labour years through the eyes of the voter. And later last year, a new book came out, Beyond the Red Wall, Why Labour Lost, How the Conservatives Won, and What Will Happen Next, which I think does pretty much what it says on the tin, probably, Deborah. So with that, Deborah, over to you.
Perfect, thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me along, and thanks to all of you for coming along to listen to what I have to say. I'm going to kick off just by kind of running through a few of the headlines, the points that I'd like to make, and then I'll go through each of those points in a little bit more detail, and then open it up because there's obviously lots to sort of chat through. And I think, so what I want to say, obviously at the moment, this is in some ways an optimistic time. I think there's lots of talk of unity. What's happened in the US is encouraging and puts a bit of a spring in the step for everyone, I think, and we can be forgiven for hoping that some of that feeling rubs off on us. And I did a talk earlier today to the organisation More in Common, which was the organisation that was founded after Jo Cox was murdered initially by her relatives and friends, and now has become a wider movement. They asked me to go along and talk about the values that we share. Which I did, but I caveated it by saying, when we want to think about how we can bring people together and the values that we share, which is what you've asked me to talk about as well, I think we do have to understand that we are only going to be able to move forward by fully understanding the differences too. And Brexit, of course, shone a light on those differences. And I think it's worth kind of pausing and reflecting on how this happened and why. And that was very much, what I set out to do with the book that I wrote, where, like a lot of people, I was surprised at the extent of Labour's loss, particularly in those heartland seats, and was very, very keen to understand why. So I spent a large chunk of time up there in a number of constituencies at the beginning of last year. And so what I'm drawing on here is partly that, and then I've got a little update at the end. So some points I'm going to make to you. The first is that, and I think, I presume you are all here because you're quite interested in politics. I'm quite interested in politics. We are very unusual in being interested in politics. And I think if you are interested in politics, it's quite hard to get your head around that. And most voters Most voters in the red wall, frankly, most voters everywhere, are not very interested in politics. However, my second point will be that Brexit was a bit of an exception, and I will tell you why. The third point I'll make is that Brexit was seen, rightly or wrongly, and by the way, I don't see my job as setting out to prove to voters where they've gone wrong, but simply to understand what they think and analyse that. A lot of them saw Brexit as an antidote to the wrongs that they feel that they identify in their own lives, locally, nationally, and internationally. Brexit also highlighted values differences, and I'll talk about those. I will also say that despite that, though, my overriding observation was that Brexit was less of an ideological battle and more about a battle of ordinary working people who were voicing their discontentment to elites, or people that they saw as elites. And the last point that I'll make is an obvious one, but I think it is worth making, which was that Brexit was, of course, Boris Johnson's trump card. And I'll explain how I feel that worked for him and kind of what might happen next. And then the final point is that most of the field work that I'm referring to, I did some time ago in the run up to, to actually leaving and to the deal and so forth. And after the election. But what I then did on the annual anniversary of the election was to go back to some of the people that I'd interviewed before and ask them what they felt now, to see what change had happened, if any. So I will update a little bit on that, and in fact on some more recent work that Britain Thinks has done. So let me run through this. I'm going to start with the first point about not being very interested in politics. And, proof of that, if you needed it, was that I ran a focus group through the election campaign on live on TV, where, and this is something that will get edited out, I think, if it had been pre-recorded, but it was live on the Victoria Derbyshire show. One participant told us how much she liked Nigel Farage, but she went on to say she'd never vote for him because she didn't have much truck with the Lib Dems. She didn't think they stood for very much, but she did like him. He was great. On another occasion, half of a focus group that I was running, when I showed them a photograph, failed to correctly identify the man that was then Prime Minister. That was David Cameron. It's not at all unusual for focus group members to be completely unable to name a single member of the cabinet. But people do know one thing. Politicians are a breed apart, and whatever the party, their otherness is the thing that unites them. So the thing that politicians have in common is that they are not like us. And as such, they have very little idea about the way we live our lives, of the people they purport to represent. And a recent survey by Britain Thinks found that just 6% agree UK politicians understand people like me. And the people that I talked to in the Red Wall, who believe themselves, with good reason, frankly, to be particularly neglected and ignored by Westminster, have switched off from politics even more than most. Quite simply, their votes, which they gifted unconditionally to Labour for a very long time, had seemed to count for very little. It had delivered, in their view, very little to them. And that was why they took it away. So people aren't interested in politics, but Brexit was an exception. It was something that people found highly motivating. It stood out as a political moment. It was different and deeply significant, particularly for those Red Wall constituents. Why? Well, because although it wasn't often mentioned at first in the focus groups that I ran and the interviews I ran for the book, Brexit would really quickly surface in discussion and go on to be debated with huge enthusiasm by the people in the focus groups, even by those who'd voted Remain, actually, and about a third of people in the Red Wall seats that I visited had voted Remain. At the very least, it was seen to be a bit of a circuit breaker, forcing a much needed step change in our politics, something that would shake things up, as one Red Waller told me, and goodness knows we need that, he went on to say. Another told me that Brexit meant a new start for the whole country, and a new start round here too. So What do they mean by that? For a lot of people, Brexit was a bit of an antidote to the many, many wrongs that they identified locally, nationally, and internationally. And in the Red Wall, expectations were set very high. So one of the people that I interviewed was a retired butcher in Oswaldtwistle in the Hyndburn constituency called Ken. And he told me for the first time in what he thought might be decades, he felt really optimistic. And he was particularly optimistic about his grandkids' future. And he said to me, we used to have the best of engineering, agriculture, and fishing. And now that we can set our own rules, we will again. That's what he told me. The decline of British manufacturing weighed very heavily for Ken. He said, this area used to be known for its weaving sheds, and now there aren't any at all. He shook his head very sadly as he told me that. And I asked him how this was the EU's fault. What did it have to do with the EU? He wasn't actually very sure about exactly how it had anything to do with the EU, but he was really certain of one thing, and that was that Brexit offered a corrective that the country needed. And that was the view that I heard again and again and again. Another person in the same constituency was a lady called Michelle in Accrington, who ran the butty shop in Accrington. And she believed that leaving the EU also would revitalise Britain's manufacturing industry and it would bring back jobs. She felt it would be good for agriculture too. And she asked me if I knew where the milk in the tea that she'd made me came from, and I didn't. I asked her and she said, and she paused for effect, she said, Holland. Yes, Holland. And it's not as if we don't have cows around here, is it? She said. And that she thought was about to change. So, you know, it was a moment for people. But it wasn't just about what they saw as the practicalities and jobs. It highlighted some values differences too. And I'm sure a lot of people on the call will be familiar with the work that Lord Ashcroft does. It's a fantastically rich source that he publishes and makes available of data. He spends a lot of money on polling. He's got a lot of money to spend. And he published a very interesting poll immediately after the referendum, which I've quoted again and again and again. It asked people whether they felt that an assortment of kind of values-led concepts, multiculturalism, feminism, globalism, liberalism, I always call it the ism poll, whether they were a source of good or a source of evil. So quite strongly worded. And the poll divided people down the middle by Brexit vote. So leavers felt very strongly that all of these things were a force of ill, while Remainers felt that they were a source of good. By the way, he ran the same poll in the US and got exactly the same divide by whether you voted Trump or not on exactly the same issues. And it's still one of the starkest examples of that values divide that I have ever seen. And the overriding sense was that the elites championed those isms and benefited from them in a way that ordinary people did not and could not. And that brings me on to the next point, because despite what I've just said, I think this wasn't, for most people, an ideological battle. It was a battle, in their view, of ordinary working people like them against elite voices. And it reminded me of a focus group of Leave voters that I did the week after the referendum. And I did this focus group for the Today programme. So it's being filmed by the BBC. And the crew that were filming it literally sat with their jaws on the floor as the people were talking. And there was one wonderful moment where a man told me that when he woke up the next morning and found that Britain had gone Brexit, he had leapt out of bed and he had run round his bedroom in circles, punching the air with joy. And he said to me, I felt like England had won the World Cup. And he described this sort of joyous moment. And he then said, but it was more than that. He said, I was sticking two fingers up to them. And I said, who were they? And he said, the elites. It's like a matter of fact. He nodded and everybody in the focus group nodded. Yep, it was the elites. And it was echoed around the Red Wall all the time. People felt neglected. They felt ignored. They felt they had been for decades. They also felt judged and looked down on by those in charge, particularly in the Labour Party. There was a very interesting woman that I interviewed in Darlington called Yvonne. She was really angry. And this is what she said to me. She said, they started attacking people like me and calling us ignorant and ill-educated. It was paternalism. They said, we know best. I was so angry and upset and hurt about that. So there was this absolutely bruised feeling that people felt, and they were seeking revenge. So this became Boris Johnson's electoral trump card. And I don't know how many times I've been asked, how could it be that an old Etonian, you know, who went to Oxford, who is, as you know, spouts Latin, is as posh as you can get, could reach out to those people in the Red Wall? And it wasn't just that. What they told me in the Red Wall was that what Boris Johnson had done was de-snobify the Tory party. That is a direct quote from somebody that I interviewed, but it was echoed again and again and again. And what he did in doing that was to give die-hard Labour loyalists a license to break the habit of a lifetime. What it was a shorthand for saying, I share your beliefs. I'm not sneering at you. I am with you. I agree with you. And in doing so, demonstrating more solidarity with them than Labour had done in years. So, as well as apparently tackling immigration, Brexit embraced something else that the Red Wallers held very dear, and that was patriotism. So, a lot told me that Johnson was going to put the great back in Britain again. And by the way, here's a little aside, thinking about the Red Wall, one of the things that came through very clearly was that people identified very, very closely with their local areas, not at all with their nearest big city. So if you're in Accrington, you never go to Manchester. It's not something that you have any identification. So the fact that Manchester is doing well makes no difference to you. And by the way, it takes an hour and 20 minutes to get there on the train. So you don't go there very much. So you care about your local community. Your life is lived out in your local streets. You know, you probably work a very short walk away. You live, all your friends, your family live nearby. You care about that, and you care about the country. So putting the great back in Britain, using Brexit to sort of seize that moment was about creating a step change that people believed was going to rebalance the country, redirecting power and resource back to their particular corner of it. And of course, you know, Boris Johnson and the Tories were very well aware of this. They'd done a lot of work up there, done a lot of focus groups. They'd listened to people. That is what the levelling up agenda is all about, and what it's based on, and why it's being done. And even those more cautiously inclined, and that included, you know, a number of people that I spoke to in Red Wall seats who had voted Remain, felt grateful for the more modest claim of getting Brexit done. There was a woman that I spoke to in Stoke who was sad about Brexiting, but at the same time, she said, we just had to draw a line. We couldn't keep talking about it. There was a feeling that the country had become paralysed, and we just had to move on. Everybody I spoke to was tired of the debate and willing politicians to concentrate on the things that mattered to them. I invited focus groups to recreate the Trump slogan, make Britain, and then I left a blank. What do you want to make Britain again? They did want Britain to be great again, but actually what people put most often, normal. Make Britain normal again. Let's get back to thinking about the things that we all care about. So finally then, just a little bit of an update, because what I did was to go back to re-interview some of the people, because boy, a lot of water had gone under the bridge. And I wanted to find out how they felt, and you know, what difference COVID had made, what difference actually Brexiting had made. And their answers were unequivocal. I mean, one of the questions I said was, given COVID, is it still a priority to Brexit? Should we still be focused on that? And yeah, I mean, they were really unequivocal. There was one of the most interesting and intelligent people that I interviewed was a plumber from Accrington called Ian. And he said to me, and this is a quote from him, if Brexit were dropped now, I'd be disappointed. I'd think that the elite had wriggled out of it again. And I pressed him and I said, would that be true? This is interviewing him in October. Would that hold true, even given the possibility of leaving with no deal? And at that time, that was something that's being talked up a lot. and in common with every other Leave voter that I spoke to, and indeed some of the Remainers, was quite sure. He spoke for them when he asserted, we just have to get on with it now and start making our own way in the world. You know, because politics may have often seemed to make very little difference to their lives, but they had staked a lot on Brexit making a difference, on the Brexit outcome, and they were watching it very, very carefully indeed. And just a final thing that I would say is that Britain Thinks, the company that I co-founded and I'm now joint chair of, has been doing a project since immediately after the referendum. We called it the Brexit Diaries, and we started actually with the traditional kind of diary methodology. We later added in polling and focus groups as well. And we did our most recent wave of this in December, so before the deal was sorted. And it's actually on our website if anybody wants to have a look at it, and look at that particular wave. But one of the things that I think was most telling was that we asked people to project ahead 10 years and what they thought our country would be like in 10 years' time. And once again, we saw this unbelievably clear divide. And the divide was by how you voted in the Brexit vote. So we asked people how optimistic they felt, whether the country would be more or less united, more or less equal, more or less wealthy, more or less poor, more or less respected on the world stage, whether we would be more or less in control of our own destiny. And in that work, what we found was total polarization. If you voted Remain, you basically think we're all going to hell in a handcart. And if you voted Leave, you have a bit of a spring in your step right now. And the other thing that we found was very few regrets on either side. When we asked people would they vote again, they were pretty clear that they would vote the same way. So perhaps if I leave it there, I can see there are a few questions. Shall I hand back to you, Michael?
Yes, thank you, Deborah. That was great, if sobering.
Yes. Sorry.
So yes, you've ruined my evening. So perhaps I could kick off with maybe one or two first questions. We've got some great questions coming in. So if people have got others, please start typing them in the chat while I'm wittering now. And then my colleagues, Paul Brown, our chair in Cambridge for Europe, and one of my colleagues on the committee here will read those questions where people want them read. So if I could just start off with a question, Deborah, you talked a bit this evening about a sense among many voters that politics in Britain is broken. I think you said 6% had any faith in politicians or belief in politicians' ability to achieve anything. But lots of people who are in the pro-European movement, in sort of progressive politics more widely, what are clearly going to be characterized as the elite by some quarters. But lots of us now are turning to think about voting systems and political reform because we share that feeling that politics is broken. But the kind of things that people are coming up with, the kind of practical actions around things like PR, campaign finance reform, possibly federal structures for England, for the UK, but an attempt to try and coalesce around practical actions to make politics work better, to make the voices of people heard. But those organs that claim to speak for red wall voters, so I'm thinking of the tabloid press essentially here, tend to condemn all those topics as being precisely elitist. People speaking to themselves within the elite. Do you think there's any room for common ground between red wall voters who feel that politics is broken and those of us in the pro-European and progressive movements who feel that politics is broken and want to do practical things about it?
I mean, I think they agree that politics is broken. They don't then, rather uninspired by the remedies you've suggested, though. And I think we saw that. We've kind of been here. We've had a referendum, in fact, on constitutional reform, and we know what happened there. And yes, it actually, funnily enough, it did do very well in Cambridge. I seem to recall. I think he sort of made the point, really. I think it was London, particularly North London, where I live. It was Cambridge, it was Oxford, it was Edinburgh. I think those were the 4 places that sort of supported the referendum. I mean, it's, you know, there may be another way of positioning that. There may be another way of bringing that to life. But yeah, and certainly things like, you know, I mean, talking about funding reform can be done, you know, I mean, that, you know, Trump sort of drained the swamp stuff and so on, I mean, was very much, I mean, I think made that appeal to people in a very different way. There are ways of making those things sound more attractive to people, more compelling, but you know, I don't think that constitutional conventions and the like are ever things that are going to set ordinary people on fire. You know, they're just, they're boring sort of process things that only interest geeks, I think. Sorry.
Yeah, no, you've depressed me even more now. That's fine. Which is probably helpful. Can I ask one more, perhaps sort of linked to that, and then I'll hand over. But I just wanted to ask a point about age, because something else I think you've said elsewhere in some of the Britain Thinks' publications is that young people can feel particularly pessimistic about the state of the nation. Again, within progressive and pro-European movements, I think there's often an assumption, perhaps, that whatever our immediate losses in the long term, that the future may come to us because of different attitudes amongst young people. Do you think is it foolish to pin our hopes in that way on younger people, or do you think there is a chance that we'll see shifts in the kind of attitudes you're talking about simply as we see generational change?
I mean, I think it would be complacent to rely on that, but it is obviously the case that younger people, for example, are more likely to remain, more likely to be pro-European. I would say, that said, that, you know, in some of those red wall seats, however, the young people in those red wall seats are not that different from the older people in the red wall seats. You know, that it isn't true that across the piece that's the case. And I could see one of the questions was about class, and I mean, that's also true. There's also quite a strong class and education even more than class, although the two obviously correlate. Age and education correlate as well. The younger you are, the more likely you are to be a graduate and to be more highly educated, etc. But I do think there is some reason to believe that. I mean, I think the election we've just seen in the States was due to a number of things, but it was in part due to the fact that you know, Democrat supporters who are also sort of younger, BME, etc., are gradually becoming a larger swathe of the population. And thanks to the efforts of extraordinarily talented people like Stacey Abrams kind of, you know, getting the vote out. And if you haven't seen that documentary, which is on Netflix and Amazon and what have you, it's superb, really worth watching. You know, I think there is something there, but I think it would be complacent not to try to understand. See, I think in the end, for all that I've just said about the red wall, and I hope this comes through the book, Brexit was in a way a symptom, not a cause. You know, Brexit became a symbol, and it became a focus for discontentment that was real and valid. And, you know, when those people there told me that they felt neglected, I could look around and think, they're not wrong, they bloody are neglected. You know, these places, some of them are terrible places to live with really very little going for them. The shopping centres were run down, the streets were run down, there was no work, there was nothing, you know, I mean, hopeless places that have been neglected for a very long time, on Labour's watch as well, by the way.
Okay, thanks, Deborah. Paul, can I hand over to you to pick up on some of the questions that have been coming in?
Okay, actually, this question for Deborah here on a slightly different theme here is, Do you detect any enthusiasm among your Red Wall voters for a Daniel Hannan-style bonfire of regulations agenda? I think this just feeds into what motivated Brexit, the political backers of Brexit versus the voters.
Not really, is the truth. I don't think I ever heard anybody talk about a bonfire of regulations or to. I mean, you know, there's a feeling that there's a lot of antagonism towards the EU, and a feeling that the EU was serving its own purpose, not ours, and yeah, and a lot of kind of irrational blaming of the EU for things that were you know, not the fault of the EU at all. In terms of sort of red tape and so on, not really, not a huge thing, I don't think. I wouldn't say it's a huge appetite. Again, that's kind of a processy thing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple more questions here. One is actually two which are kind of related in a sense. One is, in your view, under what circumstances do former Labour voters come rushing back to Labour? And one I actually submitted myself was about there seems to be consensus that the economic impact of Brexit and of COVID will be felt most severely in Red Wall and similar seats over the next coming years. And do you think that will have an impact, and how long that might take to filter through into people's voting patterns?
Yeah, I mean, they're certainly not rushing back to Labour at the moment. That's for sure. And I mean, I don't, you know, there's some internal polling that's been leaked, I presume, as a sort of expectation management exercise in The Guardian today. I'm assuming that, you know, the leadership of the Labour Party are concerned about how they're going to do in the May elections, and are starting to sort of leak some stuff to manage expectations there. That is internal polling of Labour's that's been leaked that says that they are doing very poorly in terms of winning back Tory, you know, Labour voters who switched to the Tories. They are doing a bit better, picking up a few Green votes here and there and a few Lib Dem votes here and there, but not doing well on the Tory voters. And that, I would say, is something that's borne out again by my return to the Red Wall, where I think there are a number of things going on. I mean, one thing to say is that if you are, you know, a voter who has taken a massive decision, having been a Labour voter all your life, and it's not just you, your parents were Labour voters, your grandparents were Labour voters, and you've switched, and people felt this was an enormous decision to take. And a lot of the people I interviewed said to me things like, my father or grandfather or whoever would be spinning in their grave if they knew that I'd voted Tory. So big decision. You then have quite a lot invested in that kind of working out. And so you want to give the benefit of the doubt. And therefore Labour needs to do something quite arresting to win them back. And I think we're not seeing that at the moment. I mean, I think, you know, there was a lot of antagonism towards Jeremy Corbyn. Okay, he's not there anymore. Keir Starmer has established himself well as being not Jeremy Corbyn, but beyond that, I'm not sure that he's doing enough. Now, I mean, it's obviously very difficult circumstances for him of COVID to sort of, you know, set his stall out. But basically, when I asked people to sum up the government in a word or two in December, the word that they used most often was unlucky, which gives you a clue, because I think what we see is they are cutting quite a lot of slack for Boris Johnson, that, you know, COVID gives him an excuse. Back to, you know, you conflated, I think, Brexit and COVID and the economic implications. It could just be that COVID provides an excuse for the other, right? It remains to be seen if this is the case. I'm simply putting that as a possibility. When I asked what words they would associate with Labour, the words they chose most often were words like absent and invisible. So
I've seen that echoed elsewhere actually recently. So that's
so yeah. You know, it's difficult for Labour, and they've also been unlucky, but they are going to need to do a lot more, I think, to cut through.
Actually, there was another question. Do you think that Labour are listening to to what people like you are producing, the evidence and the polling?
I'm sure they're listening to evidence and polling. Yeah, yes, I think so. I'm sure they're doing. They're obviously doing polling. Yeah.
Yeah. But do you think that's actually informing their the way they're dealing with the situation at the moment?
COVID,
or in sense of is there's invisibility that you mentioned earlier? Is that a result of? Is that kind of deliberate just to keep their heads down, or would you say it's more a case of they're just trying to the difficulties cutting through, or they haven't actually figured out how to?
Everybody says, famously, being leader of the opposition is the toughest job in British politics. It's very, very hard at the best of times to get noticed. Back to what I said about people not recognising the Prime Minister, people who thought Nigel Farage was a member of the Lib Dem politician. People aren't looking, and you have to do something you have to be very striking and very consistent. It was Tony Blair who said, just when you are getting completely bored to death of saying that thing again and again and again is the moment where the voters might have started hearing it. And I think that's true. And Boris Johnson understands this well. And I remember in the election doing some work for the BBC. We ran a big event with a lot of undecided voters in Crewe during the election campaign. We had 100 undecided voters in the room. And at one point, I said to them, right, I'm going to count 1, 2, 3. I want you to shout out any campaign slogan that you can recall. So 1, 2, 3. And they all, as one, shouted, "Get Brexit done." So I said, okay, that's the Tory slogan. Thank you. I'm now going to count 1, 2, 3. I want you to shout out the Labour slogan. And 1, 2, 3. And there was a sort of silence. And then a few people came up, all said different things. And, there was no sense. So Boris Johnson just said again and again and again, "Get Brexit done." It was the right message for, the job. And it registered.
Okay. Yeah. We've got a few questions on a similar theme here about the essentially misinformation. You mentioned the irrational blaming of the EU in the Brexit debate. Yeah. And is it safe to say this was down to misinformation, and what can we do to clamp down on disinformation? This is obviously something that's being debated in the US at the moment as well, to try and heal or repair broken politics, I guess, restore respect for the truth. Related to that, there's also a question on the EU and the fact that it didn't really do an awful lot to explain the benefits of membership. And do you feel there is much knowledge of EU benefits, particularly on freedom of movement, or understanding at all of freedom of movement? I would add to that.
So when I first started advising Labour in the 1980s, one of the first things that I did was I, with my then business partner, Philip Gould, we were commissioned to do some work for the British Labour group in Europe. And we did a piece of work looking at attitudes towards Europe. This is in the 1980s. And the headline basically from the work that we did, which was quite an extensive piece of work, was the problem is that people can list all of the things that are wrong with the EU. They can come up with loads of stuff and they're very eye-catching, all the kind of bendy bananas and, you name it, ice cream and black pudding. And then you ask them to name any benefits and they can't. And it's a massive, massive problem. And so far as I can see, that problem has never been fixed. It's never been sorted. It's never been resolved. Interestingly, things are a little bit different in Scotland, where you're much more likely to see the signs that you see in other European places where you're saying that, this thing has been funded by European funding. A little bit different in Scotland, but I think in other parts of Britain, you don't see that. And there's very little awareness and lots of awareness of the downsides. To the point about facts, yes, I agree. And I do think in some ways COVID offers an opportunity here, because I think that experts have enjoyed a bit of a kind of rejuvenation as a result of COVID, where we're hanging on the every word of people like Chris Whitty and Jonathan Van Tam and others. And I think, yes, of course, you know, there were huge problems in the States and problems here too about misinformation. But in a way, the bigger problem is one that's much harder to fix, and it's something that we're all susceptible to, which is basically confirmation bias, that we're all drawn to people who agree with us. We look out things that support the views we already hold. And my best example of this is, in fact, during the referendum campaign, where I spoke at lots of events, and I took to saying at those events, I want to do a bit of a straw poll here. Stick your hand up if you think that Remain is going to win. And everybody in the audience would always put their hand up. There'd maybe be 2 or 3 people out of a large audience that wouldn't. Everybody would have their hand up. I'd look around the panel, even the people that were there speaking for the Leave campaign would have their hand up. It was absolutely, the belief that people had with the sorts of people who, usually business leaders, politicians, sorts of people who were in that kind of audience, because they were believing the people that they talked to who thought like them. And I would say to them, there's no rational reason to think this. The polling does not say that. Again, a thing that I heard again and again and again was the polls got Brexit wrong. They didn't. They got it right within a margin of error. And in fact, through the campaign, more polls projected a Leave win than a Remain win. But people saw what they wanted to see. So confirmation bias, it affects us all. It's quite hard to aim off for that, because we're not terribly, I think we're very good at listening to people that agree with us and seeking them out. We're much less good at listening to people that don't.
Yeah, no, I remember that at the time, actually, wondering about the complacency, looking at the polls and thinking, are people looking at the same polls I am?
But people were really clear. And then subsequently, again, as I say, really clear. How many times I've had to correct people saying the polls got it wrong. They didn't get it wrong. They actually didn't. They got it wrong in the election that followed, but they didn't get it wrong in the referendum. They were right, broadly.
I've got another question, actually, is more about Labour. Could Labour make some kind of recovery in the Red Wall through grassroots community activism aimed at addressing some of the issues of neglect and decay which have blighted these towns?
Yes, and I think that's absolutely right. And I think that the Labour Party itself is part of the problem. I mean, see somebody, Ernesto, further up saying Labour's dog with lots of infighting. Yes, that's true. And again, it's something that people have noticed and commented on. And it's just like, why would I listen to you? Sort yourselves out, guys. Come back when you have, And I think in a way, something that would be very useful for the Labour Party would be to focus its members on actually campaigning and being out there and doing things in their local communities that their local community finds useful, rather than fighting amongst themselves and having kind of arcane debates in meetings or on Zoom as they do now. And so yes, I think it could. I mean, one of the things that, and I think it's something that really does need to be tackled, the decay of those town centres. And I talk about this in the book. It came through very clearly. It was particularly an issue with women voters. And there was a really interesting piece of work that was done by the pollster Peter Kellner, where he looked at the correlation of towns that voted Brexit and losing a Marks and Spencer in that town. And it was something that came up again in the interviews I did for the book, where people would bemoan the fact that there wasn't an M&S in their local town. And it was a sort of symbol of wholesome, good things being taken away from them, and something they felt very sad about. And yes, I think it would be a really good thing to do.
Okay. You've mentioned the elite and how people brought up the elite in the meetings you've done, the polls, not polls, the focus groups. Could you actually unpick a little bit about what people there meant by the elite? When they're talking about the elite, is it about power? Is it about education? Is it about just people who live in cities? who are the elite? Because I think we often find it very odd because we think of elites, it's a different elite altogether, one which often might back Brexit. So,
yeah. I mean, it's sort of all of the above. I mean, it's graduates, because a lot of the people that I spoke to in those constituencies were much less likely to be. It's people who work with their, work with their heads rather than work with their hands, or work in caring roles. I mean, pretty much everybody I interviewed worked with their hands, were manual workers, or if you were a man, or if you were a woman, you were probably a carer, doing in some sort of caring role. So it's about the kind of work you do. It's about the kind of education that you've had. It's about where you live. It's about, the newspaper you read. It's a whole host of things. I mean, power takes you to another place. And again, one of the questions I was asked again and again and again, which I've referred to already, how on earth could Boris Johnson de-snobify the Tory party, as people say? The thing is that for a lot of the people I spoke to in the Red Wall, it's a very nuanced difference, the difference between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn or Keir Starmer, especially if he's Sir Keir Starmer. I mean, all three of those men are off the scale posh, in a way they're all from another planet, really, compared with the people that, so there was no differentiation. It's not like, you might look and say, well, there's a bit of a hierarchy here. You've got Boris Johnson, who's very posh, but hey, Keir Starmer, and Jeremy Corbyn went to private school, but isn't as posh as that. And then, Keir Starmer's dad was actually a manual worker, but he's Sir Keir Starmer. He's a lawyer. He comes from a different world. So yeah, it's all of those things, I think.
Okay, and we've got a question, I think, on Scotland. It might be worth addressing because we're going to be talking a lot about Scotland, I feel, over the next 5 years. And Scotland might well vote for independence, but would Red Wall voters care if Brexit resulted in the breakup of the UK? And I guess the same might apply to Northern Ireland as well. Do they actually really think much about Northern Ireland when they're voting?
They would care about the breakup of Britain. Yes, I think they care very much about that, actually. I mean, by the way, they wouldn't, the way that question is constructed, I'm not sure they'd necessarily blame Brexit for it. They would blame local nationalism, I think, although they hugely admire Nicola Sturgeon. Nicola Sturgeon is very greatly admired by voters in England, and is seen, I'm not sure the facts bear this out, but thought to have had a better pandemic than Boris Johnson because she's seen to be a very clear communicator. But yes, I mean, Scotland is a huge problem for Labour. I mean, again, it's about back to, the words constitutional convention, I think, never win very many votes. I mean, Gordon Brown might. I mean, he's my old boss. I worked for Gordon when Labour was in government. He is still very highly regarded there, and I think Keir Starmer appointing him was a smart move. Because one of the things, and I think I talk about this in the book, actually, one of the things that I was reminded of when I did the work in the Red Wall was some work that I was commissioned to do in Scotland in 2011. Ahead of local elections, where Labour were very worried that they were going to lose Glasgow Council. And I was commissioned by Margaret Curran, who was the then shadow Scottish minister, and Anna Sarwar, who was then, who's now running, I think, to be the Labour leader in Scotland and is an MSP, but was then an MP. Actually, so I did the work. They didn't, in fact, lose Glasgow, but they did go on to lose Scotland. And the work that I did really told the story of how that was going to happen, because I was shocked at how negative those Scottish voters were about Labour. And basically the story again was one of neglect. What they said to me in Glasgow was, what Labour have done is, they put in one of their top people as our local MP, and that person then looks south to build their career. They go to Westminster and you never see them again. And there was this absolute feeling of neglect, and they felt quite bereft. And it was a story I heard again and again in the Red Wall, where they would say, Labour has put their favourite son, it usually was a son rather than a favourite daughter, in to this safe seat where they felt they didn't have to do any work, and they would, basically come up once a month and run a surgery, and that was it. So yeah, similar story. And yes, Scotland is a huge problem.
I've got another question on isms again here. If so many of the red wall voters thought all the isms were bad, how could get any amount of getting out into the community and trying to fix local problems ever compensate? Or will Labour have to start bashing multiculturalism and adopt an anti-immigration or anti-equality rhetoric? I would guess in light of what we've seen from Jenrick and others in the Tories, who are kind of trying to spark a culture war to replace Brexit, it seems.
Yeah.
Sorry to say, also be interesting to see how that maybe might apply in Scotland, where the culture war rhetoric might have a very different impact. It's maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think in all places, by the way, the Ashcroft poll, the ISM poll, isn't looking at red wall voters, it's looking at Leave voters, but you can extrapolate across, of course, to a degree. And certainly, I mean, one of the stories that I tell in the book, to the culture war point, was doing a focus group with men in Accrington, and it was when the Labour leadership contest was going on, and that week the Labour leadership contest had been totally dominated by the candidates positioning on the trans debate, and one of the men turned to me, and I think it's really important to stress here, there was no hostility. It was, you know, just he was just baffled, really. He turned to me and he said to me, how many trans people are there in Britain? And it was honestly, I think it was a genuine question. You know, he was just like, why are they spending so much time talking about this? Because I just don't think it's that big an issue when we've got really big problems here that I'd like them to be talking about. And I think that at its heart, the problem with the culture war is simply that you're being distracted by things that are not the things that matter to those people. It's not that they are hostile or that they are up in arms. They certainly don't want to debate them themselves. But what they do want is you to be thinking about their rundown town centre, or the fact that their children don't have any jobs, you know, and that they've got poor quality housing, et cetera, et cetera. And that, you know, that's where they want the debate to be. And I think in some ways, the best way of not getting distracted by that is not getting distracted by it and understanding clearly what people do want you to be talking about. And they're not unreasonable in what they want. So I think that's the answer, really.
No, I think it's interesting. Yeah. So let me find out a few questions. Sorry, I think I missed a few earlier.
There's
what about levelling up? I don't know if it would be useful for me to talk about that, because I think that's quite an interesting thing. It was way back, but there was one about levelling up. Should I just say a little bit about that?
Yes, that was one of the ones I was looking for, actually.
Yeah, because it's really interesting, because levelling up, funnily enough, I mean, it sort of potentially strikes the right chord. It's certainly, you know, I'm absolutely certain it's a policy offer that has been developed on an understanding of this feeling of neglect in the Red Wall, but it slightly misses, interestingly. I mean, this might have changed now, but I didn't find anybody using that terminology or understanding it very clearly. And when I explained it to people, they were very skeptical, because they don't actually see levelling up as a very feasible thing to do. And it's not necessarily what they want either, because they see resource as a kind of zero-sum game. And actually, they think on the whole that their area can't get better unless somebody else's area gets worse, specifically London. And the resentment, by the way, towards London was absolutely palpable. The feeling that London doesn't deliver anything to the rest of the country, and that it sort of absorbs all of the good stuff at their expense, was really, really palpable.
Paul, you're muted there, Paul.
Sorry, had something pinging in the background. Michael, did you have a question there? Or?
Well, there was just one that I'd seen that I thought was interesting and maybe worth just flagging up. Somebody asked, but actually maybe two things. There were a couple of people asked whether climate change and environmental issues had any cut through in the Red Wall. And secondly, somebody asked about they had a plan to put out some ads on Facebook targeting soft leavers, and they were wondering what kind of messages might be useful to use there.
How are we defining soft leavers?
Now, as I'm not the person who wrote the question, I can only try and interpret, I think. But I presume we're meaning somebody who perhaps wasn't a Brexit Party voter, was not was not somebody who felt invested in Euroscepticism, but decided to vote for Brexit, because they wanted change rather than that they were interested in Brexit per se.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's partly one thing I would say, and what a lot of the sort of campaigning that I see now from the Remain side tends to be very much in the "we told you so" mode. So the main thing I would say is, whatever you do, don't do that, because it is just not the best way of winning somebody over to your side to say you're an idiot and I'm right and you're wrong. Can't you see that? And so pointing out some of the early problems might be a helpful thing to do, but it almost always seems to be couched in the kind of "I told you so" mode, and I think that's just not very helpful. I'm not sure what the objective is at this point of reaching out to people in the way that's being suggested. So it's quite hard to know what you might do instead, because I don't know quite what you're aiming to achieve by doing it. For my money, I would probably back off for a bit, I think, and let things settle down. I think that's where I would come out and focus your energies on something else for the time being. But that's probably not very welcome advice. I should say, by the way, I'm a Remain voter. So, and quite passionately Remain, but I'm just being...
No, it's a very active debate in the Remain movement, actually, among the people as to what, should we seek more realistic interim goals?
I'm just not sure what, because I think, and on the whole, as I say, when I see it, it's mainly people saying, look, gosh, who knew all this sort of stuff? I mean, what's the point of that? I just do not understand that at all.
The question about from Caroline Mull is similar to why are they talking about trans people? Would Red Wall voters be baffled and put off by talk about rejoining the EU? I think you might have already answered that to an extent. In other words, it's
horrified. Frankly, I'd include a lot of Remainers in that too, which is why some Remain voters voted Johnson, as I think I've already said, because they just want the debate over. So I think I'd shut up about it, actually. I think honestly would be my advice. You can ignore it and you probably will, but that would be my advice.
Well, so yeah, Keir, I suppose you'd agree, this is Keir Starmer right not to want to have it in the next Labour manifesto.
Bang on, and he was also right, I think, to say to support the deal as well.
You might have to disagree slightly on that, but I think certainly voting against it would have been a mistake.
Yeah.
So have you got any idea whether he will lose too many progressive Labour voters by not addressing the relationship with the EU? I suppose there is an element of to what extent he addresses the relationship as well there. But,
yeah, I mean, I think again, I think it's about what he does talk about, funnily enough, not what he doesn't talk about. And I mean, I think there will be ways of appealing to those voters. But yes, I think I think revisiting that is just not a helpful place to go at the moment. It will be in time, I'm sure, but not for now.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any more questions? I'm trying to...
Paul, as we're probably running quite short on time, but there was do environmental issues have any catch for voters in red wall areas, which I thought was worth exploring?
Yeah. I can truthfully say it was never once mentioned to me spontaneously as a thing that motivated people. I have done some work specifically looking at environmental issues in red wall seats separately for a client, and you know, there are some ways of engaging those people, but I mean, I think that it's not top of their list. I mean, the point about the environment actually is that it's very, very highly motivating to a relatively small group of people. It's dropped down the sort of list of things that people are worried about. They're much more worried, and this is not just red wall, this is all voters. They're very worried about health, obviously. They're worried about the economy now. And so I think that if you are talking about the environment, probably very local environmental things, of probably, so people are quite concerned about their local environment. But yeah, it's not a big and persuasive argument, I would say.
Okay.
I think there were a couple of questions. I can't see them now, but a few people were asking about how much migration is an issue. Migration, immigration.
I didn't find it a huge, I mean, you know, one of the characteristics of red wall seats is that there isn't much traffic in and out of them, actually. So I didn't find it to be a massive, massive thing in the red wall.
So, yeah. Or was it more just as a kind of nebulous, just not at all, or just more as just a kind of an abstract thing, or?
I would say, I'm trying to think about if it was mentioned at all. Mostly, no, just not really mentioned. Just not really something that, as I say, I mean, it is really, there's the Resolution Foundation did quite an interesting piece of work, which I quote a lot in the book, and is worth looking at. I think it's on their website, or, you know, I pulled out the interesting things in the book. But one of the, as I say, one of the things that they note was they did you know, kind of economic analysis of red wall seats. And one of the defining characteristics is this lack of movement. So immigration, movement in and out, doesn't happen that much.
Okay. There's another question on, been asked, any awareness of the impact of Brexit on Northern Ireland?
A little bit, not much.
Maybe just as a final question, there's a question: is the over-centralised nature of government in Britain a factor in red wall voting? Weak local government leaving people powerless. I guess this goes into the whole regional devolution issue as well. Is there much appetite for that, or? Well,
funnily enough, I think one of the game changers here has been the local mayors, and there were a couple of local mayors who were sort of rock stars, really. So a lot of, you know, for a lot of people, they would look at their local councillors. Again, it was a problem for Labour often, was they would look at the local council, and that would be seen as a shorthand for how Labour might perform in government, and usually it wasn't good. Conversely, in the northeast, so I spent some time up in Darlington, Ben Houchen, who is the local mayor up there for that area, is regarded as a local hero and has done a huge amount in terms of persuading people that the Tory party might be on their side. So that can work very well. Again, actually, thinking about the pandemic and going back to some of the people I'd interviewed and chatting to them again to see what difference COVID had made, Andy Burnham, although, for instance, in Accrington, they didn't pay much attention to what was going on in Manchester by and large, but Andy Burnham had done very well I think in persuaded them that he really understood what was going on. So I think some of those local mayors might well have made a real difference, and that could be a very helpful development.
Shades of take back control.
Yeah.
Shall I finish things up there, Paul, as I think we're probably about at time.
I think we've gone through most of the questions here at this stage. There's been quite a lot. So apologies if I've missed any.
Well, can I, unfortunately, as ever on Zoom calls, our applause will have to be silent. But perhaps I could ask for some silent applause for Deborah. That was fantastic, Deborah. I thought really compelling, if obviously challenging. I noted illuminating but depressing was in the chat.
Yes, I've seen a few notes saying how depressing. And if you want to be really depressed, I buy the book and read it from cover to cover. I've tried to make it about the people, and they're interesting people. Yeah, no, and I think it's tremendously important for those of us coming from a different place to try and understand where it is that others in the electorate are coming from. So that was really, really helpful. So thanks again, Deborah. And if I could just finish by just mentioning again, I did at the top of things, but our next event's the 18th of February at 7 o'clock, and that's going to be with Dame Matheny-Donald talking about higher education and science policy. So a shift of gear there. But will almost certainly be a lot more positive from your point of view than I've been as well.
Well, I think she may have her challenges to face too. Actually. So
Brilliant.
But thanks, Deborah, and thanks to everybody who's asked questions as well.
Thank you. I'll just say I've just put the link for the talk by Matheny-Donald in the chat there. So again, I'd like to thank Deborah and for everyone for all the questions. You could have kept us going for another hour, I feel.
Brilliant. Thanks all. Bye-bye.